so glad you're here, 'cause now you'll be able to float with me into the realm of supersonic creation, the void crevices of hallucinogenic hypersensitivity.
You just heard the voice of Electric Bob, who is featured on the opening track of the Square 2 by Little Phil and the Night Shadows, the band's 1968 psychedelic punk blues classic. So what's the big whoop about the Square 2, you might ask? Well, if you've got a copy in original mint condition, the high-rolling collectors of vinyl records will gladly cough up $2,000 or more for a copy of it. My name's Alec Janulis, and I was the album's producer and the group's organizer and bass player. That's a picture of me in my glory years a half a century ago, and this is me now attempting to document the events that led up to making what became a cult classic to high-rolling record collectors and modern garage bands. The 10-year history of the Night Shadows contains 4 distinct music chapters: the rhythm and blues period, their show band period, the Little Phil era, and their psychedelic years. Since I'm somewhat of a history buff, I decided to go back in time for a prequel to the Night Shadows to record what I believe are the events that not only led up to the Square 2, but to the very essence of all music we listen to today. The year I decided to start was 1937, 4 years before I was born. Why 1937? Because that was the year the electric guitar was patented by George Beecham after a 3-year battle with other competitors in the patent office. Without the electric guitar, rock and roll would not have evolved from its acoustic roots of blues and country music. During the following year, in 1938, engineers in Nazi Germany developed a top-secret device called the magnetophone, the world's first tape recorder. It was highly classified because propaganda broadcasts over the radio could be made without listeners knowing they were listening to recordings. Up until that time, all broadcasts had to be made live. For those born in the digital age, tape recorders were analog machines that captured sound prior to digital recorders. In 1939, a year later, my parents, both children of Greek immigrants, were married. A family picture of them taken on Easter looks like they could have lived next door to Don Corleone. That old pic of my family gave me the inspiration to name my last all-original band Big Al Jano and the Blues Mafia. In February 1940, Broadcast Music Incorporated went into business, opened its doors. It was comprised of a bunch of radio stations that got together to compete with ASCAP, the licensing agent that was primarily interested in classical music, stage show music, and jazz and swing bands. They didn't give much credit to small bands, country groups, and things of that nature. And BMI was very important because in the 1950s they were set up to really start licensing small record companies that would be putting out rock and roll and getting rock and roll started. 2 years after my parents were married, I was downloaded on October the 8th, 1941. 2 months later, the U.S. declared war on Japan and Germany, and World War II began. When my dad was drafted into the Army, my mother and I had to stay with my grandparents and her unmarried brother and sisters. My Uncle Jimmy was only 14 years older than me, but he would become very influential in me becoming interested in music in later years, as you'll see. In 1946, my dad was released from duty from the Pacific and returned home. About a year later, he partnered with his brother and 2 other men to open the first white-owned black restaurant in segregated Atlanta. The same year the Village Grill opened, I started elementary school where I would eventually meet 2 of the original Night Shadows, Ronnie Farmer, who played guitar, and Mike Moore, who played keyboards, and just recently passed away in August of 2013. The Village Grill had a Wurlitzer jukebox that played 78 RPM blues records. On a day my dad took me with him to repair the refrigerator compressor, I heard my first blues tune on his jukebox. While he was replacing the broken belt on the compressor, I was sitting on a stool behind one of the counters, and I started listening to some of the music being played on the jukebox. The song I liked the most on the jukebox was called the Woodpecker Song. Woody Woodpecker was my favorite cartoon character next to Donald Duck back in those days. Well, one of the customers in the grill must have liked the Woodpecker Song too, because he kept putting nickels in the jukebox and it kept playing over and over again. So I got to hear it 2 or 3 times while my dad was fixing this compressor, and it had easy lyrics, so I memorized them. One day in school a couple of months later, my teacher asked everyone in the class to think of a song or a poem that they liked, and she was going to go around the room and let everybody say a line or two or sing a line or two. So when it got to be my turn, I decided to sing the Woodpecker Song. And when I started singing, I could not believe the look of horror on my teacher's face. I thought the song was about Woody Woodpecker, the cartoon character. The lines I sang were, "Woodpecker sitting on a telephone line said his pecker wasn't long as mine. Long pecker, pecker long." Well, it wasn't until years later when I found out what I was really singing about. It wasn't a cartoon character. I credit my teacher's red face and the double meaning of the Woodpecker Song is the reason that I eventually started writing comedy songs with double meanings years later in the Night Shadows and in other bands I've been in since the Night Shadows. In 1948, 3 important events laid some additional groundwork for music and the eventual birth of rock and roll. The first was President Truman's executive order to desegregate the military. Up until that time, non-commissioned officers and enlisted men's clubs and canteens were segregated. After the armed services were integrated, white soldiers got to hear black rhythm and blues bands playing in some of the mixed bars and clubs that they all attended at that time. It exposed them to a different kind of music other than big band swing sounds. The second event of note was the first American tape recorder for recording high-quality sound was produced by the Ampex Corporation with the financial assistance of Bing Crosby and the reverse engineering of the Nazi magnetophone machines that were captured after the war. The third major event of note in 1948 was the introduction of the long-playing vinyl record. 1948 was also the last year boys in school wore knickers, and there I am in the last pair of knickers I ever wore. As a side note, when men's shorts cut below the knee became popular, to all of us who wore knickers that were banded below their knee, the new loose style looked like a clown's pants without the striped socks and the big oversized shoes. In 1949, the vinyl 45 RPM single was introduced to the public, and the RCA Victor Company manufactured a 10-disc 45 RPM record changer that became the most desired record player for neighborhood house parties of the 1950s. Also in 1949, in Atlanta, Georgia, a black radio station went on the air for the first time. WERD Radio started broadcasting rhythm and blues and black gospel to Atlanta listeners. I did not find out about this station until my uncle returned from the Korean War in 1952. As a kid in the 1940s, I loved listening to the funny songs of Spike Jones and his City Slickers on the radio. When his band finally came to Atlanta in 1950, my mother took me to the Atlanta City Auditorium to see them. It was my very first concert, and I was mesmerized. That same year, the Korean War broke out, and my Uncle Jimmy was drafted. When my grandfather died, however, my uncle was released from duty in January of '52 because he was the sole surviving son of the family and had to return to Atlanta to take over his business. While in the Army, my uncle heard the black rhythm and blues bands in the integrated service clubs and really liked that music. At a family dinner after he returned to the States, he told me about the music and how he also found it on WERD radio. After dinner, we left the table, and he tuned the family radio into WERD, and I realized when I listened to the music, that was the same music I'd heard at my dad's grill years ago on the jukebox. So while the kids at my elementary school were listening to songs on the radio like How Much Is That Doggy in the Window by Patti Page, I was listening to songs like Crawling King Snake by John Lee Hooker on WERD radio. Also in 1952, my cousin Chris Botsaris got me interested in filming home movies and tape recording. Chris would go on to become Chris Clark, a TV news anchor in Nashville, and hire a very young Oprah Winfrey for her very first job on television. I also became close friends with Mike Moore and Ronnie Farmer in my 5th grade class that same year. They would become two of the original Night Shadows a few years later. The following year, in 1953, 3 important entertainment milestones occurred. The original Hound Dog was recorded by Big Mama Thornton. Now, this blues tune would become a rock and roll hit later for Elvis Presley. Okie Dokie Stomp, an R&B big band instrumental, was released by the Pluma Davis Orchestra featuring Gatemouth Brown on lead guitar. Now, this record demonstrated the electric guitar could be used as an electrifying lead instrument. Up until then, saxophones, trumpets, and clarinets and pianos were the dominant lead instruments. A movie released in 1953 that had no rock music on its soundtrack became the milestone for the future rock and roll. The black and white film was The Wild One with Marlon Brando. It was about 2 rival motorcycle gangs that took control of a small town. The Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, led by Brando, wore all black leather jackets as their uniform. Brando's hairstyle and sideburns in that movie were adopted by Elvis for his look, as well as many rockabilly bands and most juvenile delinquents at the time. The other biker gang was led by Lee Marvin, and they were all dressed differently and were called the Beatles. The Wild One was banned in the United Kingdom for 14 years, but it is believed that the Beatles of Liverpool adopted the name from the movie after seeing it in Hamburg in 1960. The early pics of the Beatles also emulated Brando's look and the black motorcycle jackets of his biker club. I purchased my first biker jacket when I was 14, before I even had a license to drive. In 1954, Bill Haley and the Comets released Rock Around the Clock, and the term rock and roll was credited to Alan Freed that same year, a disc jockey and concert promoter. It was also the year I bought my first record in the summer before I turned 13. While the kids in elementary school were buying How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, I purchased a 78 RPM blues record by champion Jack Dupree titled Shim Sham Shimmy. It was the flip side of Drunk Again, and I thought it was more rocking and had a better feel than Bill Haley's hit. My dad's reaction when I played it at home on the family's Admiral entertainment console was, I have to listen to that damn crap on the jukebox all day long, so cut that off while I'm here. In December of 1954, I finally got a movie camera and a projector for Christmas like my cousin Chris's, but not nearly as expensive. I think that my Christmas present was to play silent movies instead of loud rock and blues. Fortunately, my interest in sound recording would come the following year. Around the end of 1954, the beginning of 1955, the first white blues band of note in Atlanta was formed. It was called Magic Jerry and the Mojo Men. Also formed about the same time was the Night Rockers, who were probably Atlanta's first all-rock band. And as hard as it may be to believe, they did not have a singer and only played instrumentals at packed dance floors. I really like their name, the Night Rockers. There was one particular event in 1955 that changed my primary interest from shooting home movies to music and recording music. A movie was released that year that had the first rock and roll song on its soundtrack. The movie was The Blackboard Jungle. It was about teenage juvenile delinquents, and the song only played during the opening credits. The song was Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. The sound of rock and roll being played through those huge theater speakers was absolutely electrifying. Up until that time, I'd only been listening to rhythm and blues and rock and roll on small AM radios. Car radios actually sounded better since they were equipped with aerials. Unfortunately, my dad couldn't afford a car radio or a heater in our 49 Plymouth. They were extras back in the 40s and 50s. Hearing Rock Around the Clock being played through those huge theater speakers was like a black and white picture that suddenly turned to color for me. I stayed in the theater from 11 o'clock in the morning till 9 p.m. that night. Since I was only 13 at the time, my parents called the police wondering if I had been kidnapped before I caught a bus to go home. There's no way of explaining the high I got from the sound that I heard in the theater from going from low fidelity to high fidelity. The difference in the speaker sizes of my two radios and the voice of theater is the best visual I can give you of it. There were 2, possibly 4 voice of theater speakers pumping out loud rock and roll. Bill Haley's tune, a minor hit in 1954, became a monster hit in 1955 after the movie's release. In June of 1955, Chess Records released Maybelline by Chuck Berry. This record got a lot of guys interested in learning how to play the guitar, including 2 that would become forerunners of the Night Shadows. Later that year, in October, the movie Rebel Without a Cause was released. It did not have a single rock tune on its entire soundtrack, but the movie defined the generational differences between parents and kids that evolved after the Korean War. Before the 1950s, kids and teenagers dressed similar to their parents and listened and danced to the very same music that their parents listened to. Everything was pretty much the same for both generations. But the events in the mid-1950s changed everything. In December 1955, Elvis Presley appeared in concert at the sports arena in Atlanta's Cabbagetown, one of the roughest white neighborhoods in the city at that time. Since I was only 14, there was no way I could go see Elvis. They just wouldn't let me go. However, to appease me for not being able to go see Elvis, my parents let me get my first tape recorder for that Christmas, since I'd become so interested in sound once I heard Rock Around the Clock in that huge theater. 6 months later, in 1956, on a very hot summer night, my Uncle Jimmy picked me up in his air-conditioned 1955 Cadillac and took me to my first juke joint. He knew I was a big fan of R&B music like he was, so at 14 I got to go to Hale's Supper Club in Atlanta's Cabbagetown to hear a live blues band. The cop checking IDs at the door was named Mitchell, and he was a personal friend of our family's. He let me sneak in with my uncle and 2 of his friends. The band playing that night was Dr. Harmonica Zach's band. I was absolutely blown away hearing live blues. It gave me a body high like the experience I had in the theater the previous year. Sometime that same summer or early fall, Ronnie Farmer, who was one of my schoolmates, got his first guitar. John Pittner, an older cousin of Ronnie's, also got a guitar, and they started taking lessons and playing together. When school started that fall, I found out they were playing guitar, so I offered to record them on my new tape recorder. In 1957, Ronnie and Johnny started putting together a group of their friends who were Grady High School band members. Craig Wimmers, I believe, was the first drummer. Bud Millenbaugh played sax. George Richardson played a washtub bass, and Mike Moore eventually joined up on piano. The group became known as the Cavaliers, spelled with a C. Since I was too young to drive, Johnny, who was 16, drove Ronnie over to my house to record. After that first recording session, I tried to learn how to play on a friend's acoustic guitar. Unfortunately, the guitar neck was warped and the strings were pretty high, making it difficult for me to play. At one of the recording sessions, I told Ronnie and Johnny I wished I could play saxophone or something, which was my fave instrument at that particular time in the 1950s. But I didn't want to spend time learning to read music in order to play one. Ronnie told me that if I would buy an electric bass, they would let me play in their band, because the washtub bass in their group wasn't very good for rock and roll. I had seen a washtub bass, but I had no clue as to what an electric bass was, so I asked him to describe it, and he said it only had 4 big strings on it. I thought to myself, well, I might be able to play this. Sounds like it'd be easier if it's only got 4 strings instead of 6. So I might buy one if he'd teach me how to play it. He said he would. I had enough money to buy an instrument by working weekends at the Village Grill and throwing newspapers after school, but there was a problem getting a bass. The large acoustic bass was the standard of the day, and many of the acoustic bass players were switching over to electric bass. The production of them at the time could not meet the demand. Almost every day for 3 weeks I tried unsuccessfully to buy a bass guitar. By the time I got to the music stores after school, they were out of the bass guitars. If they had been delivered earlier that day, it's been sold. Since I had to work on Saturdays, shopping on the bass on weekends was also out. I told Ronnie the problem I was having. He suggested me buying a bass from the Carvin Company in Covina, California. Carvin is a mail-order instrument company that's been in business since the 1940s. They had just started making electric basses about this time, so I sent them a check for $135. That was the full price for the bass, the hard shell case, and shipping charges. 3 weeks later, I got my first electric bass in the morning mail while I was at school. The post office used to deliver mail twice a day in the 1950s, and I was hoping it would be delivered in the afternoon when I was at home. I was going to hide it from my parents to avoid the hassle it was going to cause. They did not want me getting involved in music since I was on a course to get a science or engineering scholarship. Luckily, the additional cost for sending it back to Carvin for a refund made them change their mind, so they let me keep it. Now I had an electric bass, there was another problem. I didn't have an amplifier, and I'd spent all my money. When I realized that the magnetic pickups on the bass created a similar signal to my stereo turntable's magnetic cartridge for playing records, I decided to connect the bass to my stereo system via the magnetic input, and it worked. But alas, another problem. The bass blew out my stereo small speakers almost the first time I tried to play it. Undaunted, I knew that all I needed was a larger speaker in the cabin and not a costly bass amp to get some kind of a sound. I found what I needed totally by accident in a camera store. It was a used extension speaker for a 16mm sound projector, and it was only $15, which I could afford by selling part of my old coin collection. Once I hooked it up to the stereo, I got a fairly decent sound out of it. And what's even better, I became a member of the Cavaliers with a K, and the washed-up bass player was out of the band. When my cousin Nick Janulis found out I had joined the band, he told me that 3 of his schoolmates were also players and were really exceptional. Donald Adams played a smooth trumpet, Bobby Newell played a rocking piano, and Ray Massey provided kick-ass drumming. I arranged the jam session with all of them, plus Ronnie and Johnny of the Cavaliers. After the jam, we replaced our drummer with Massey and added Donald Adams to the group. Bobby Newell would join the group later in the fall of 1959 when Mike Moore quit to go to college. Once again, another band started using the Cavaliers as a name, but this time it was spelled with a K like ours, so we became the Barons with our new lineup. In these early days of rock and roll, there were only a handful of bands that could play old standards from the 1940s and some of the latest pop tunes from the 1950s. We could do both, especially since we had Donald Adams on trumpet. Bookings came in mostly by word of mouth from club to club or school to school. The group was really excited about our first out-of-town booking in South Georgia. Strangely, I went out of town to Hartford, Connecticut, because I had won the Georgia State Science Fair with my science project on solar energy, and I had to represent the state as a finalist in the National Science Fair. I hated missing that gig, but I ended up with a scholarship to Georgia Tech, which eventually gave us a lot of gigs later on in all the fraternities. I graduated from high school about a month later, so the whole summer was devoted to practicing and rehearsing with the Barons. Bands played a lot of instrumentals back in the 1950s, so Ronnie Farmer, the lead guitar player, wrote an original instrumental to add to our playlist. When I asked what he called the tune, he said he called it Night Shadows. And I blurted out that should be the name of our band from the moment I'd heard the name. Everyone resisted another name change, but I knew that a band name like the Night Shadows would create more of a mystique than the Barons would. It was also the perfect name for a rock and roll band that was also heavy into blues, which we were. Band politics voted me down on the name change, so I did what any type A person would do. I had business cards with the Night Shadows printed on them at my expense, and went out and booked several jobs under the name The Night Shadows that were paying jobs. So when money talks, egos walk. We were now the Night Shadows, and I assumed all the booking responsibilities. Our first gig as the Night Shadows was a masquerade dance, and I got it by promising the band would come in some kind of a costume, something no other group would agree to doing for them. After we performed the first set as beatniks and won the crowd over, we changed back to our normal look at the time. One night in that summer of 1959, I drove to Hale Supper Club to hear harmonica Zach play again. Mitchell the cop let me in since I looked 21, and he knew me from coming in with my uncle 3 years earlier. That was the night I met who would become our first frontman for the Night Shadows. I was sitting at a table in a location indicated by the red X, listening to the band, when a guy dancing in front of me yelled, "Duck!" Two guys had gotten into an argument, and one of them threw the chair at the other one that would have hit me if I hadn't been warned. All hell broke out behind me, so I got up and went out on the dance floor to stand where my savior that night had been dancing. After Mitchell and Roy Hale broke up the fighting and threw several people out of the club, I met the guy that kept me from getting my head bashed in. He had kind of a James Dean look and said his name was Bobby Jones. He told me he was a blues singer that also played harmonica. Zach let him sit in with the band that night, and I was blown away with him. I got his telephone number and told him I wanted to set up a jam with him and my group, the Night Shadows. I had a feeling if he became our frontman for the Night Shadows, we'd have a hell of a show. And he did become our frontman for the Night Shadows in 1960. We had mistakenly thought Mike Moore was going off to college in the fall of '59, so Bobby Newell was hired to take his place on piano. Therefore, the band lineup was now Bobby Jones, vocals and harmonica, Johnny Pittner, rhythm guitar, Ray Massey, drums, Bobby Newell, piano, Ronnie Farmer, lead guitar, vocals, and yours truly, Alec Janulis on bass and vocals. And that's how the Night Shadows started.